Hey everybody, it's Colleen, known better to all of you as Polyglot Weekly. I'm finally back with episode 2 of our podcast, Polyglot Perspectives, and I'm so excited for you to hear our interviewee this time. She is near and dear to the Polyglot Weekly family, Brad's sister, Amy. Amy's experience with language learning and the languages that she has chosen to learn are so different from my own experience. And so I know I haven't written anything about it or posted anything on the blog about it. Therefore, I'm really excited to share her experiences with you. It was a great interview, and I hope you enjoy it as much as we enjoyed recording it. Happy listening. Okay, we're here for our second interview with Amy, Brad's sister, because, languages run in the family, apparently. And her specialty is actually something that I've not talked about much on the blog because, frankly, I don't know anything about it. So that is the word dead or extinct?
I'll take dead.
Dead languages.
I'm not offended.
No, okay, so, we're resurrecting the skeletons here of dead languages. So, Amy, you want to go ahead and tell them what languages you know and what levels you feel you are with those?
Obviously, native English speaker, so fluent in English. And then I learned on an academic level both biblical Hebrew and biblical Greek. So I don't know, it's not the same as spoken language. So fluency was never really the goal in my studies. But I am to the point in both that if someone is reading from the Bible, I can follow along in the original, not lose my spot, and be able to kind of do that translating on the fly sort of thing. So I have the functionality that I was hoping to achieve. I don't know what,
You're literate in both.
Yeah. I'm able to move my way through it pretty easily. And when at the, heights of my studying in both, it was very easy to, translate quickly and understand the gist of passages, even if I didn't know all of the words or weren't familiar with them.
Sounds good. You want to walk us through your language learning journey? I know we talked about, you went to the same high school as the rest of us, but you didn't take Spanish with our lovely Spanish teacher like Brad, Olga, and I got to laugh about last time.
I didn't. I signed up for Spanish and then they told me there was no room. So I ended up taking French. And it was, I think, ineffectual at best would be a good way to describe it. I was saying earlier how the only words I remember are the ones we had jokes about. And I wish that I had retained more because I later traveled to France and it would have been helpful. But I knew how to point and order water, so that was good.
That's something, at least, right? So then you went off to college and you decided to study biblical studies.
Yeah. Within the first year of college, I had come in undeclared, dabbled in some things, but found I enjoyed my Bible classes the most. So I decided biblical studies was kind of the route I wanted to go. And in that degree at my school, you had to take one of the two biblical languages, either Greek or Hebrew. And since the school only offered Greek, I took Greek. So I had, I think, 3 semesters of a class and 1 semester of an independent study in Greek. And then when I went on to grad school, I did 2 semesters of Hebrew and TA'd for 1 semester as well. So those were both motivated by the larger thing I was pursuing of biblical studies, but were huge components in what I was doing.
Cool. Alrighty. You said dead's fine. Some people use extinct, but I liked how you phrased it earlier. You said it's dead with living counterparts. You want to explain what that phrasing means? Yeah.
Well, obviously there is still spoken Hebrew today, and there's also spoken modern Greek, because both of those cultures, continued on over the years, and the language morphed in both cases. So in both Greek and Hebrew, what I learned is not what is being spoken now, but it bears a lot of similarities. Either Greek or Hebrew, modern signs in those countries are things that the alphabet is the same as what I learned, and sometimes I can read them, especially in Hebrew, I found. But I'm not sure how much Greek has shifted, just because the Greek of the first century there was nothing really in the culture that caused anybody to retain a close tie to that.
Yeah.
But as I was saying earlier with biblical Hebrew, there is that huge religious component to the Jewish culture. And so even today, because it's both a identity of culture and a religion, that biblical text is so tied to their culture and what they do that you hear the biblical text with that ancient Hebrew recited so often that it's commonplace for those people. So I don't know this from experience because I don't know any modern Hebrew, but I think it probably bears more similarities and hasn't departed as much just because those texts are still in like everyday use. Whereas Koine Greek, there wasn't really anything in history that made any person group like really latch on to that form of the language.
Yeah, the only suggestion we had was possibly Greek Orthodox, and we don't know, but we thought maybe those who are very heavily involved with the Greek Orthodox Church might have kept that language more alive, and it may be in areas, barrios, ghettos, whatever you want to call them, where that is very fundamental to that culture. It could be that the Greek there is more antiquated and therefore would resemble it more. But obviously bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, things like that are still around. Obviously Hebrew has kept this tie to the culture as much as to it being used.
Because the Bible is such a part of, the Torah is such a part of their history.
Exactly.
That as a people, regardless of if they're religious or not, it has some kind of effect on, even just the story of that country. So I think it's inescapable that the language didn't die to the same extent that maybe like Greek or like Latin did.
Exactly. So what would you say for most people, and for yourself, of course, is the goal when people are studying these dead or extinct languages? What are they actually, what instrumental purposes are they hoping to get out of it? What emotional purposes? What do most people hope to get out of studying dead languages?
For me, both Greek and Hebrew are basically tools in the larger pursuit of biblical studies. So biblical studies is, looking at translating and interpreting scripture and doing theology and all of that. So the point of my degrees was never, to know Greek or to know Hebrew. It was just one of the components. And so the motivation is different than, like Brad learning Japanese to be able to talk to people and watch anime and read stuff and like go over to Japan and be able to function. My goal was never to be able to construct sentences. It was never to be able to have a conversation in any of these languages. It was these, set texts that I wanted to be able to understand in their original form. So initially in studying, it was a lot of, learning the grammar so that I could just translate it, that I could look at a word, I could know the English equivalent, and then I could build an English sentence that said the same thing. It wasn't always pretty, but that was, the initial experience. And then once the translating wasn't so burdensome, it wasn't so difficult to do, that's when like the interpretation that is tied into biblical studies at large comes in. So the point is not just to take the Hebrew passage or the Greek passage word for word to portray it in English, but rather to be able to, yes, restate it in English for people, but also be able to take, well, this Greek word has this nuance, and so that's how it affects our understanding of this passage or what this author was saying, or, this belief we have, this theological argument we make, anything like that. So the goal, I would say, was to be able to understand and then explain that original form of the passage.
That makes sense, yeah. And I mean, it goes back to even with modern languages, why translate software is never going to be sufficient. There's always going to be these nuances and aspects that people have to be able to look at to actually interpret what something's really saying. True. So one thing that's always, of course, interesting with dead languages is the issue of skills. You don't really have a listening component, especially in one that is so textually derived. You did talk about, when you were talking about it earlier, it's not exactly that they're speaking, but there's a pronunciation element. You want to talk about?
Yeah. I did Greek first in undergrad, and at the very beginning, our professor explained that different scholars disagree about how to pronounce different Greek letters, just because we don't know. We don't have any, audio recordings from the first century. So we can't know how they were pronouncing these sounds. But in our class, he had us, come to an agreement. Some of them we even voted on of, how are we going to say this? Because we're going to be talking talking about these passages. We're going to be, quizzing each other. So we need to have a way we're pronouncing all of these things. But there really wasn't a whole lot of reading to be done. It was just, oh, hey, this word came up and I need a way to pronounce it to you. Hebrew was a little bit different because there is such a verbal aspect to just that culture and that history of the text.
And in fact, you mentioned they have punctuation to indicate inflections
and
all sorts of things.
There are markings on the words that tell cantor how to basically sing the passage. And so if you listen to it being read in like a religious setting, the person is almost, sing-song reading the passage itself. So we never learned that. We were threatened with it, but we never learned it.
Which I had to comment on because I've watched a whole bunch of Hebrew movies out of nowhere because I'm a Netflix addict and we all know this. And I go through my little foreign, preferences. For whatever reason, Hebrew was one of them at the time. And I said, it is funny because I said I felt like there were all these different times I heard stuff and it did have this sing-songy feel to it, which makes a lot of sense if it's even included,
Right, yeah. It was not original to the text. Hebrew is actually constructed of only consonants, and so vowel markings were added later and accents as well.
Interesting.
So it's all part of the history of, this story or whatever was told, and it was recited throughout history the same way over and over and over and over and over and over till somebody wrote it down. And then it was such a part of the fabric of that culture and that religion that, it became important to record the way it was recited too.
So it's this whole oral storytelling, a lot like the Native Americans we hear about, that was part of what was being passed down.
Yeah, yeah. The Jewish people were not real concerned with, hauling books around the desert when they were wandering.
Understandably so. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
These stories that were, intrinsic to their identity and their faith were something that, a grandmother told a certain way, and then when that grandmother passed, the daughter then was telling her daughters, or and
the sing-songy makes it more likely to be kept,
right? Yeah,
in that manner,
right? And so you think about the songs you knew as a kid, or the opening to Barney or something. Like you can still sing it because you heard it, every day at noon whenever you were watching it as a kid. And so I think in the same way, when you grew up in this culture and you heard these stories told in the same way over and over again, it became not just like a method, but it became part of the story.
True.
And so when they did start writing these things down, which was often much later from, that source story itself, they wanted to preserve the way, because everybody wasn't necessarily going to be sitting around talking about it anymore. And there were points in Israel's history where they weren't even speaking Hebrew anymore. They were speaking other languages. So only in that religious context was this ever being used. And so some people couldn't even understand what they were reading, but they still wanted them to read it the same way.
Okay.
So
that makes a lot of sense.
The pronunciation was a little bit more important to my professor in Hebrew just because of that aspect. So he was a little bit more, we didn't translate much of anything that we didn't read aloud before we gave a translation or before we talked about. And he even had, certain prayers that he would teach us that had different, intonations and stuff. So there's a bit more of like I said, with Biblical Greek, we don't know how they pronounce some of the sounds. With Biblical Hebrew, we do, because they're still pronouncing it in synagogues and ceremonies and that kind of thing.
Same way. So we have a pronunciation element. Of course, there's a lot of reading.
Yeah.
And I mean, that would basically be the key skill. And then to some degree writing, but it's really more, as you were putting it, translation and interpretation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. With both of them, I did a lot of writing just on homework. I would typically write out the passage I was working with myself and then do all of my parsing above it, so that I had a lot of practice writing the characters and they weren't hard to come up with. And I also taught myself to type with both of them as well, because sometimes it's easier to be able to print out your homework.
Yes, of course.
And at first, that's the slowest way to do your homework, but at a certain point you become proficient enough that it's way quicker.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's not, I was not emailing anybody in Greek or Hebrew, but I was doing assignments that required me to be able to reproduce stuff. And so that's where the writing came in.
True. While we're there, why don't we just go ahead and talk about, we said, I always ask people to give definitions of different words. And the two that come up again and again in something like this are translation and interpretation. And again, these are words that in our community, in our little polyglot language enthusiast community, and the fighting words. People get ticked about like what they feel each one means. Mm-hmm. For what you did, what would you say would be the difference between translation and interpretation?
Yeah. I feel like every time, because I've had even just like people at my church ask me about that. And I feel like I always kind of talk a circle around the whole thing and then finally get to a different point where I started off.
Okay, so we can work with circles. It's all right.
But because I think I said earlier that, you know, at the very beginning of learning both of these languages, we were focused almost solely on translation. We were trying to build enough of the grammar framework so that I could take passages from the text and then I could translate them. I could figure out what word, you know, this was in English and construct a sentence out of it that made some kind of sense.
Yeah, you had to explain it was that whole word by word.
Yeah.
idea.
You know, I have a noun here and I, you know, either know it from my flashcards or I look it up and then what is the noun in English that means. And so after you got past that initial point where you built a vocabulary and you had studied nouns and verbs, then we, you know, integrated a lot more of the interpretation. And that was where it wasn't just, you know, make sure you can construct a sentence and translate this. It was, what does it mean? What's the best word? You have this whole lexical range that this word fills. What does the author really mean? If he was speaking in English, which one would he have picked? Yeah. Which then kind of brings that circle back, and you realize you were doing interpretation all along because you had a list of words that meant, and you had to pick one. I think it's just very uninformed interpretation at first.
For the record, the cat once again has decided to interrupt our interview. Fortunately, Brad's here to entertain it, so we're going to let him do that. Okay. So
I think that, you know, that was one of the things our professor said over and over again, that there is no translation without interpretation. You have to do some of that, and if you're not aware that you're doing it, you're probably not doing it very well.
Yeah.
And one of my professors would say, you know, at certain points, you know enough of this to be dangerous, so be careful. Because he had given us tools, he had built things, and we at times would feel like we understood more than we did. So, you know, that warning was like, don't go out there and pretend that you can interpret all of this more effectively and more accurately than anybody before you ever has, because you're really beginners.
Yeah.
But I think that to understand, like, the task itself, you have to realize, like, especially I found between English and Hebrew, there's such a gulf between those cultures.
Yes.
They're just so different. And so you can't just translate. You have to enter into the mindset to some degree. And the languages don't function the same, so there really is no word-to-word translation to be done, or you'll be missing verbs in your sentences, which English doesn't like.
True story.
So I think that from the beginning, you always have a component of interpretation. You're probably not going to be very good at it or not be doing it on a very deep level until you have a better understanding of, like, translation and just the grammar and the language itself.
And you had mentioned earlier, you were talking about with interpretation that it can go all this way from this kind of, I think this is where you were mentioning the whole literal to dynamic.
Yeah.
And you want to talk about that a little bit, because I think that's a very important thing for people to understand.
Yeah.
There is this spectrum with Bible studies, but I would say it's with a lot of other things as well. This whole idea of liberal to dynamic.
Yeah. Well, there are just different, like, philosophies behind how you translate. And, you know, it's an argument in biblical studies because it's considered a sacred text to certain groups. And so there's more at stake for people at times than just, you know, like, how did they translate this, you know, French story? So in biblical studies, obviously, you can go to a store and buy a Bible, but every Bible is going to have some, you know, acronym attached to it that stands for whatever translation. And I had said earlier that one of the most common ones in this day and age, especially like when I was growing up, I feel like the 90s was kind of the heyday of the NIV.
NIV standing for
New International Version.
And you had also mentioned there's we talked about there were two other common ones. Of course, a lot of people are familiar with the King James version or the New King James version. And then there's ESV, which I had not heard about.
Yeah, and that's the English Standard Version. That's another one that a lot of people, you can buy a devotional Bible in that.
So for those of you not familiar, if you happen to be in a store and want to look, if you look at the Bibles, Walmart has them too. You can check there. And, they may have these little initials attached, which indicates what translation they're working from, right?
Well, each board that gets together and decides to write a new translation, they agree on a certain methodology to approach the text. On one end of the spectrum is the very literal word for word. They will try to look and see, okay, we have this Greek word and it translates into this English one, and now that's what we'll keep in there. They try to preserve the word order. And they'll try to stick as close to possible as the original. So that often means giving an ancient idiom in the translation that maybe we don't use today or wouldn't even make any sense to us today.
Yeah, you had mentioned that in Old Hebrew, it was Old Hebrew, right?
Culture, in Hebrew culture, the seat of the emotions was like your bowels or, your digestive innards.
Whereas we would normally think of it as the heart.
Right. So you don't love someone with all your heart, you love someone with all your liver or something like that. Also, I think about Song of Songs. He's describing this beautiful woman and he says, your teeth are like a flock of sheep, not one is missing. And to a modern person, you're like, yes, because I go to the dentist. But, it's that idea of culture and how do you express something in one time and place and people, and how do you express it now?
Exactly.
So in a literal translation, you will get that, your teeth are like sheep. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have dynamic, where they try to take the original idea or feeling or, gist of the passage, and they try to restate that idea in modern English or whatever. English or whatever.
We said essentially a paraphrase of
it's closer to paraphrasing. If you get real far on the end of that spectrum, you basically get to a paraphrase. And so in that, with the sheep example, you probably wouldn't say, your teeth are like sheep. You would say, your teeth are as pearly as a string of pearls, a glamorous, Yeah,
they're whiter than anything or something.
Right. Yeah. So every translation falls somewhere on that spectrum, and the different translators that work on different books all try to abide in a certain area together. So you're not going to have one where, Genesis is translated word for word, and then you get to Matthew and suddenly they're being very loose with things. The translation itself will kind of try to stay in one of those pockets. And I had said that the NIV is popular for a lot of reasons, but one is because it does fall very near to the middle. They kind of try to strike that balance. And so depending on what your purpose is, I never, when I was working on translations, I would never check my translations against something that was very dynamic because it wouldn't help me, because I might be stuck on a word or trying to figure out what, the definition of this should have been. But I would sometimes turn to the New King James because it does try to be more literal. So I could go to that and go, oh, that verb meant this, and it would be much more helpful. So it just kind of depends personal taste, or, some people have very strong convictions about different translations.
Exactly.
And so it's kind of a different choice, but you do kind of discover as you're suddenly translating that there is that dilemma of, what is my goal here? Is it to express this as closely to the original as possible, or is my goal to just get that idea across? And so sometimes it's more effectual to do one or the other, but obviously I was in an academic setting and someone was grading it, so word for word
was more
most
common.
Of the time.
Yeah, especially at the levels you were talking about at this point. So, and it's, while we're on definitions, it was interesting we're talking about, and you mentioned earlier saying fluent doesn't exactly get thrown around in these kinds of studies. Even your professor probably wouldn't say, oh, I'm fluent in biblical Hebrew or Koine Greek, because that's not the way you talk about it. And we said probably not even bilingual, but maybe biliterate would be an appropriate term for it.
And it's interesting because, I could probably pick up some non-Christian writing from the first century in Greek, and if they were using very vague terms or telling a very generic story, I could probably translate it. but my vocabulary has been constrained based on the text that I was working in. So unless they're talking about the things I learned the words for, I don't know Koine Greek. I know biblical Koine Greek.
Yes.
Hebrew being a little bit different because it is, it is a culture, but it's also a religion, and they're tied so closely together. Ancient Hebrew writings are typically still about the same things that the biblical text was about. So I'd probably be more tempted to be like, oh yeah, I'm more literate in Hebrew than I am in Koine Greek. But as far as the Bible itself goes, you have a set amount of words to learn, and so you can know what percentage
which is a very nice feature that modern languages do not have.
Right,
so.
And that's my big block on learning another language that isn't dead, because I kind of like the dead ones because they're changing.
Quantifiable, which is always a nice feature.
They're not morphing, and they're not going to, in a few years, add things, and you have that with language. It adapts to what the culture is doing, and so if you learn a dead language, you have a snapshot in time, but if you're learning one that's being spoken today, you don't.
Yeah, you don't even have a painting. You have a fluid changing
It's one of those
piece.
Things that has
performance
the oil
art
that you flip over and the little bubbles.
Oh, yes, that makes sense. Okay. We didn't even say, and I had asked you, are there any communities, because many of you have probably seen the article where there is this little community, I believe it's in India, that is trying to keep Sanskrit alive. And I had said, they're out there and they're speaking Sanskrit to each other. They are trying to make this a living language again. And I had said, are there communities like that with the Koine Greek and the biblical Hebrew? You said, well, there might be, but what they could talk about is
is the biblical text.
Yeah,
I did say I have a friend that probably might, join or start one himself just because he's kind of a freak like that. But it's one of those that, in the same way that it's really nice to have that limited vocabulary that you're drawing from and that you're tasked with learning, it also does kind of kill some of the functionality of the language, because you're not really learning a language, you're learning the bits of that show up in this thing you're trying to work with.
When we were talking about different languages, sometimes, especially when we're talking constructed languages and dead languages that have been kept alive in certain pieces of our culture and society, they serve very specific purposes. And so they work for very specific conversations. With the biblical Greek, the biblical Hebrew would work for a theology conversation. We were talking about Tokipona because that was, of course, one that came up last time, and you guys had said it would be very good for emotion, I believe.
Right. Yeah, having like an emotional conversation, telling someone about feelings or a experience you just had, but wouldn't be really useful in like talking about physics or doing a math problem.
Exactly. At that point, then you're running out of options in terms of what you can say, because you only have 150 something words to work with to start with. So not ideal by any stretch. So while we're on here, and we've been talking about translation and interpretation, how do you feel looking at these texts through a different language affects your perception of them? I mean, most people who are devout Christians, devout Jews, probably, maybe not as much with Jews. And I'm not going to say I'm not a Jewish person. Please forgive me if I'm being insulting. I'm sorry. But I would say modern Jewish people probably learn enough Hebrew for their bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, and don't necessarily read their text. They listen to the cantor, but they don't necessarily even study their text in the original language. Certainly most modern Christians are only reading it in whatever their native language is. How does it affect your whole perception by looking at it through a different lens, looking at it through the different language?
I found it to be really helpful. Just because I feel like I can get closer to the heart of the matter. And there are so many things in the biblical text that cause a lot of controversy today. And so the second you start learning biblical Greek or Hebrew, like everybody wants your opinion on those things because they're like, oh, but you can read the original. So what were they really saying? And I think that by and large, translations do the best job they can to communicate those things. But there will always be that limitation of the fact that, cultures are different and they express things in different ways and words and meanings get grouped differently. So the thing that I have found really helpful is being able to acknowledge the validity of a translation, one that gets used a lot or one that gets used in an argument, but also being able to know what the other possibilities might have been, what the other meanings are behind that word, what all it was used to convey, and understanding that, the example I always go to is the word green. Green is maybe a color is the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah.
It also can be used, if someone is green, it might mean that they're jealous of someone. It might mean that they're new at something.
True.
You talk about the going, golfing at the green, suddenly now that's, a golf course. So the word itself has a lot of different meanings. And so if I say, oh, I really love that green shirt, I'm not saying, oh, I really love that beginner shirt. I'm talking about the color. But there are times that, we make plays on words and we acknowledge one meaning, even if that's not the primary one.
True.
And so I think that happens a lot in language, and I think you see it happen throughout the biblical text, where we as English translators have to pick a word. We're not going to put, this/this/this, oh, and that too, because it makes the whole thing cumbersome. And you're like, well, I could have done that by pulling up a, dictionary and just looking up each word myself. But it is helpful to be able to look at certain passages and understand, the stuff that's kind of floating around the word, the meanings behind it, and just the fact that there might be more going on that we wouldn't draw from just the English word that's chosen.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned how dead languages are a snapshot in time. In many ways, translations can be a snapshot in time as well. I mean, we said there's the New King James Version. Right. There's lots of it, lots of people, and we won't have that debate here about the old King James Version.
Right.
But a lot of people, there was a lot of pushback to that in the modern age for the fact that it was a reflection of the time period in which it was translated.
Yeah. And so it's an intriguing thing because, if you listen to the King James Version being read, it's beautiful. And that was part of their translation theory, was they not only wanted to accurately translate, they also wanted to make it sound as beautiful as the original would have sounded. So someone would translate, but then they'd have to read it, and if people were like, that didn't sound good, he'd have to go back and alter, word order, or maybe the word that he chose. But also, it is that snapshot in time. English has changed. So the these and the thous make the biblical text sound really, stilted and high and mighty, and that's not accessible to people. And so a lot of the time, that's not what people want. They don't want someone to come into a church who's never been in a church and have a guy up here in a robe saying these and thous, like they're going to turn around and leave.
Well, and we've said at that time, the average person was illiterate, and it was about listening to someone come and read it for you.
Right.
Now, for the average person of faith, the idea is that you're going in and you are studying it yourself. Right. You are wanting to access this material yourself.
Yeah.
And that does change the entire
It's not quick to read the King James Version. You can't skim.
No.
So yeah, it's one of those that new translations come out and are necessary because we change and the way we communicate things change. And so to just stick to one, which I'm kind of entering into that King James argument accidentally, but to stick to one limits how effective it's going to be in conveying meaning, because our language changes. And we're coming from this static thing, this snapshot in time, but we're using a live language to translate it into. So that's a component.
It's interesting. The dead languages that don't evolve are affected by those that do. So, yeah, fascinating. So, and then we kind of talked about, in that same vein then, does language affect thought? And I liked what you had to say on that. You want to just kind of summarize. Well, it was just interesting, especially with the Hebrew, how it affects, we talked about this thing with green, but there's more to it than that.
It was an interesting question because I don't know that ever explicitly came up in classes or anything.
It was interesting to me it hadn't come up to her because, she talks about, she's in language classes that are dealing with this interpretation and translation thing very heavily, but it had not come up. Whereas with linguistics, those of you who are familiar with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and so on, this is one of our biggest debates. It's does language affect thought? And if so, how and to what extent? And if not, let's kill this idea before it damages everything.
Right.
So
in biblical studies, we have so many hills that everybody's dying to die on that we never get around to linguistics.
Everyone's off being a martyr for something else.
We're martyring people and we're kicking and excommunicating people, so we never get around to the nitty-gritty of language. But I do think it's fascinating because you do... I guess what I ended up saying was that I don't know that language so much affects thought as language is a product of culture, and culture affects thought. Because other than with like Tokipona and other languages that someone sits and fabricates, language just arises out of a culture. And so it necessarily carries values and pieces of that culture with it. So like the example I used with Biblical Hebrew is that, you know, they didn't just have notebooks lying around to write stuff down on. The writing utensils were in demand, and sometimes it meant, you know, you were carving something into a rock or a clay tablet or something. So they were trying to be economical with their usage of their writing materials, but also the way they told their stories were very repetitive because it was a storytelling culture. So you find a lot of repetition in Biblical Hebrew, but you also find that a lot of the time, if they can get by without stating a verb, they'll skip it. Sometimes you just have like a null copula, like they're not going to use an is-are verb because you can fill it in for yourself. Other times they use that verb in the sentence above, so why are we going to use it again? You can fill it in for yourself.
The answer to my question, is there a non-verb verb-centric language? Apparently it's Biblical Hebrew.
Yeah.
Okay, good to know.
So that's, you know, that reflects the fact of, you know, the culture and some of its values, some of the ways it told stories, the things that it revolved around, but also just that reality of, you know, we don't just have paper and pens that we can go buy at Walmart. Same also in some ways with Biblical Greek, because they were typically, you know, early Christians were a persecuted group. They weren't a lot of rich people running around with, you know, supplies.
You mentioned that most of the writers that were writing in Greek were actually fishermen and not well educated.
Right. If you think about the early followers of the movement, it was, you know, the down and out people. So you just look at like Jesus's disciples, there's tons of fishermen in there. And so they aren't the most literate, they aren't the most well-spoken, and so the books written by those people are not very great Greek. Yeah. It sounds a little bit like a kindergartner.
And we simply don't think about it. Paper, and like you said, paper, we can go to Walmart and buy 10 notebooks for $5. We're good. Or we can go online and type forever and pages are free. And that was not the case in these, you know, in these dead languages that they were writing in. They don't have these materials. So it does change and alter your use in a large capacity.
Yeah. And so a lot of, you know, the first century manuscripts, they weren't writing or copying letters on blank paper. They were taking paper and basically erasing what was on it, leaving little bits of it and writing on top of it, not leaving any spaces between their words because they were trying to fit as much onto this one piece of paper that they had. And so it's those kind of things where, you know, we talked a little bit about Japanese, where it has those different levels of honoring the person you're talking to. And English doesn't do that. You know, we have Mr. and Mrs. and those kind of things, but we're not concerned with that. So a English speaker might look at Japanese and wonder, why do we have all of this? But then you meet a Japanese person and you sense certain things about them, certain things that they value, and you realize that culture is very, you know, communally based. They're concerned with the group as a whole. They're not so individualistic. And so it makes sense that their language would then necessarily flow out of that and have all of these layers of different ways to honor and consider others, where English doesn't, because that's not the same. We don't have the same culture or the same heritage.
Yeah. My friend Tetsu was talking about, you know, with Japanese versus English, and he was saying how, you know, in Japanese, the responsibility for understanding is on the listener, not on the speaker. And that often you actually, as a speaker, you're expected to, I'm going to say the word wrong, obfuscate. I think that's right. Close enough. Obstruct, make cloudy what you're trying to say to a certain degree, because that is expected, especially at certain levels with business and things. You're not supposed to come out and say things very directly.
Yeah.
And what you'll end up with, and you can hear it even in anime when they're showing a business scene or something, you'll end up with these really long sentences that don't seem to say anything.
Yeah.
And you meet someone who is a primary Japanese speaker speaking English as their second language, and it's fairly new to them, especially in an academic setting, and you'll hear these really long sentences that don't get to their point, you know, effectively coming out of their mouth in English, because that's what their Japanese has taught them to do. Now, that same person 2 years later may have shortened it or whatever, but often some of that residual culture is being carried through the language, and vice versa. Sometimes then the culture and the thought is carried through to the new language, to their old language as well. I know many people who've said they feel they become more direct in their Asian language, their native tongue, after they've been spending a lot of time in English.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how all that gets carried through.
Yeah. And so I think, with especially with Hebrew, because it's the biblical Hebrew text is very old in some parts. You do have this ancient Middle Eastern mindset. And so there are things built into the language that portray, the importance of patriarchy, or they portray, different values than we have in English. And so I think necessarily you have to kind of learn to step into that mindset. You have to, if you're just trying to read the Hebrew text as a modern American, it's not going to work. You have to make a lot of allowances just for how different things were. The fact that this is a desert culture, a desert region.
A nomadic culture at that time as well.
Right. And one that's very based on verbal communication, where our culture has reached this point where people would much rather text than make a phone call.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we are in the first generation where this line between written and oral communication is blurred.
Right.
Oral used to be the spontaneous, written was thought out, and that is not the case anymore.
No. And I mean, you see people getting all up in arms because they're not teaching cursive anymore. And it's like, it was becoming useless when I was there. And not to say it's not worth learning or whatever, not to really take a stance there, but it just shows that, that's become the more casual of the two.
Yes.
And so, I mean, I'm a person that, someone calls me and I'm going to let it go to voicemail. I will text them and see what they want. And then if they call me again, so help me. But you do see differences in a culture. The way that Hebrew is written is super repetitive. So if you translate, you're going to be writing the same phrase over and over and over again.
You mentioned the word hevel shows up all the time.
Yeah. There's, in the book of Ecclesiastes, the word hevel appears just constantly, and that's kind of the theme of the book. It's the word that's translated as vanity or meaninglessness. And the curious thing is it gets translated in different English words because it carries those different meanings, and meaningless carries a negative connotation, whereas some other word might have a more positive one.
But it also gets changed at least a little bit because in English we can't handle it being that repetitive. We're right. I have these two words that mean almost the same thing. I think I'm going to use these rather than the same word.
Yeah. And so we, at the beginning of our translations in either Greek or Hebrew, our professors would say, your translations are not going to be pretty English. If you're doing it word for word, it's not going to sound nice. It's going to sound bad, but don't cut out the repetition because I need to know that you're saying that word there. And I don't think we have next to any, published translations that really retain all of that repetitive stuff, because you're still, when you're translating, you're aiming to use good English form. But, the Hebrew culture was one to transmit their history verbally. They were going to be sitting around a fire or sitting inside a tent, hearing, the elderly tell these stories of their people or stories of their ancestors. And when you tell a story, you speak differently than you write. And that's accepted even today. Written English and spoken English are different. And so you have people recording these oral traditions, and so they do end up being repetitive, and you see that culture coming through on that. And it does kind of change, biblical Hebrew isn't worried about getting to the point. They're not cutting to the chase at any point.
No.
They're telling you a tale.
Exactly.
And so it's much different than if you're, reading a dissertation or an instruction manual or something like that. So there's just that whole realm you have to move around of, being able to kind of inhabit the thought processes and knowing enough about the history and the culture to do that effectively, but also not just abandoning your own, because then you're useless for actually communicating.
Well, and I liked how you said you have to step into these spaces.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you make camp and live there.
Right. You don't suddenly become an ancient Hebrew person just because you've been working in the biblical Hebrew.
Yes.
But you do.
Well, and that's why we try to move from not being that literal translator and not necessarily being so dynamic that we're losing what it meant, but finding that middle road where you can say, yes, this is what they literally said at that time in that place. But maybe this is how it applies now. Right.
And that's what, the larger endeavor of biblical studies does, is trying to not do that straight just translation, but to try to interpret. And that's why you have people who, they learn Greek and Hebrew and maybe never sit on a committee and do a translation, but they write books about issues that come up, or they write books about authors or different theological concepts. Because in knowing the language, you're able to, expound on stuff. It's all of those footnotes that come attached to your translation.
Exactly.
And so you get the ability to take the original text and read it or translate it, but you also get the ability to explain it to people. And I think that's really like the end of that endeavor.
Yeah, I liked how you had said at the beginning, you're like, when I went in, my goal was not to say what's right, what's wrong. It was to give people context and say, well, this is all that goes around with it. Take what you want from that.
Yeah, things in the Bible have, for me personally, become more clear in my study and in knowing the language. But that doesn't mean I'm going to go to someone and be like, you're wrong because it says this. Because that's obnoxious and also not the point. So instead, I wanted to learn these to the best of my ability so that I could translate it, understand it myself as accurately and as like in a detailed way as possible, so that then I could sit down with someone who's struggling through an issue or is confused by something, and I could say, here are all of the things that I know. Here's how I take this. Here's how some other people that I read about take it. Now, hopefully you're informed enough that you can make up your mind about it. I don't want to tell you what to think, but I do want to be able to explain stuff so that people can draw better conclusions than just listening to, one pastor who has a radio show or something like that.
Yeah, I liked how you had said earlier, you said, unfortunately, in some areas, this faith in particular has been tied so much to anti-intellectualism that people are not realizing there can be a dialogue around some of this stuff.
And there's a lot of, addiction to power, too, that sadly a lot of leadership in the church can sometimes fall into. And so you'll have pastors who, say you have to believe this or, you're going to hell, or you have to believe this or you can't, you can't sit with us. And
they're sadly almost wanting to go back to that version of there's one guy who can read it and he can stand up there and say it and you can't argue because you don't have access to it. They're almost arguing for that illiterate on a different way.
Yeah, which in a day and age where we have so many resources, and someone could go on the internet and decide, I want to learn biblical Hebrew and find the resources and do it if they're motivated to do so. And I think that's great. There is a caution to have in all of that and realize, this study has been going on for eons with really intelligent people. So don't just think that, now that I have a grasp on this, I can, I know better than everyone. But it is sad that, Christianity did go through this period where there was basically a rebellion against that idea that, no, we don't just have to go and trust you. We can read this for ourselves. That's the whole heart behind why translations started in the first place. Put it into the people's language so they can figure it out for themselves. Yeah. And that wasn't an issue in ancient times because most people weren't literate. But when literacy became more commonplace, you had that. And so it's sad to see the modern church with all of its resources and everything that, the internet and libraries and everything has to offer, then suddenly all just fall into, but I'm not supposed to. This person will explain it to me.
Yes.
So I never want to step into that role because I love critical thinking and I think everybody should do it.
Yeah.
But I do love being able to, explain some things that are like out there and a little hard to grasp, or just even being able to say, well, this is how I translated it, which is really different from this other thing. And here are my reasons why, and I can guess at their reasons. And now you can make up your mind which one you like better.
True. Well, and it's just fascinating because, you think about like the Islamic faith, where often Arabic is considered a cornerstone of what you need to learn Arabic. Most Muslims I know feel it is very essential that you learn Arabic in order to, and not only Arabic, but Quranic Arabic, so that you can read it in its original text, because they do not feel it is appropriate to read just a translation, that the translation is not accurate. And it's interesting because you're dealing with a religion that truly, within the religion itself, for the most part, does not have pastors, ministers, these leadership roles, but they believe that they want everybody to read the text. But they are hell-bent, pardon my language there, but, hell-bent that people read it in the original form. And as you put it, the translation was there almost as a revolutionary factor in this other faith of we want people to read it in their own language so that they can access it in the time and space that they are.
Right. Because Christianity spread so rapidly during its initial phases there that, you know, the people in England and France were not going to sit and learn Hebrew. It wasn't useful in any way, shape, or form, and they didn't have the time or the resources to do it.
Oh, yeah. It's not like today where you could go hop on Duolingo, and I'm sure they've got a course in the works. You know, there's probably an egg hatching right now to teach you biblical Hebrew. You know?
So it wasn't, you know, it wasn't a thing that was going to happen, whereas, you know, a lot of, like, Islam has stayed kind of central to this. It's spread more.
It's spreading now, but it was not spreading at that time.
But historically, it was much more.
It's a much more modern religion in the first place. Modern in the aspect of it's younger.
Yeah.
And therefore has grown exponentially during the time when tools were more available. Right. And I mean, to be honest, even among my Muslim friends, it is a debate of, do you have to read this in the original language? How much does that translation affect it?
Yeah.
And I mean, there's obviously these different roles of, you know, they see it as it corrupts it. And there are probably some few diehards somewhere in the Christian faith that would argue it corrupts it. Whereas most people would say, no, it makes it accessible.
Right. And that was something I can remember my Greek professor warned us about, that, you know, just because you have suddenly understood things much better, just because you are really excited about this, do not walk around and tell everybody they have to learn Greek and Hebrew.
Yes.
He's like, I have had so many students that, you know, even go on to be pastors that tell their congregations, like, I'm going to give language lessons and you better all be there, because it becomes so important to them personally that suddenly it's a requirement.
Yeah.
And that's really, you know, it's not the spirit of Christianity, and it's not really the way to, it's a tool. Original language knowledge is a tool that you can use to better understand something, to better engage with it. But when you live in a day and age where people are translating things and there are all sorts of other tools for understanding, it's not crucial. It's not life or death. And so sometimes you can get so excited about your newfound revelations that, like, you suddenly push it on others.
And we go back to what's important to you.
Yeah.
If this is something that is fundamental to you and what you want to understand, then yes.
Yeah.
But it's not, again, nothing works worse in language than trying to push it on somebody else.
You must.
You must do this. But, you know, and I liked how you said you have appreciated doing the translations, because I had said, do you have a translation that you've done that you liked better? And you said, well, I have a lot of them, mainly because you were talking about the book of Jonah, I think it was, and you said, I can sit and listen to that and I hear my own.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's a short book. And so in Hebrew too, like, that was what we used that semester for our translation homework. And so we worked through that, and, you know, along the way we were taught things about verbs and stuff. But, like, a lot of those passages come up a lot. And so there were other times that Jonah was something I was working in a class. And then, you know, would translate myself just to make sure my skills weren't. So I didn't do it the same way every time. But when I hear Jonah read from, you know, the NIV or whatever else, like, that experience, that study that I've done is all running back there as a dialogue. And so I'm like, oh, that's interesting because I chose to translate it this way. Or I remember reading, you know, this article that described something that changed, you know, the way I interpreted that. So it is one of those where, you know, I haven't sat and translated the entire Bible based on my knowledge, but I do have portions that I feel like I have a deeper, even if it's just a deeper association.
Yeah, it brings that active engagement to a degree. Like, you know, otherwise you're hearing other people's words.
Right.
There's an active translation. It's not the same as writing it, of course, yourself, but there is this act of ownership taking.
Because you have to kind of wrestle with it. And you have to look at it and try to enter into that authorial intent enough to, like, figure out what you think it was supposed to mean and make a decision. And sometimes it's a really hard decision. Two words are like, well, I think he was going for that, but he's kind of going for this idea elsewhere. So which one did he really mean? And so that wrestling and just kind of like arguing with yourself can really change the way you understand and associate with it later on.
Yeah, definitely. You know, switching gears just a little bit, you know, one thing I find interesting talking with you, of course, is we both, at least the language journeys we started with an academic setting. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we had Brad on last time, we had Megan on last time, both of whom have done far more in the independent learning realm. I'm in that realm now, not loving every minute of it. That's a story for another day. You guys have probably already heard more stories than you want to hear. But I had said to you at the Polyglot conference that I went to recently, and they've also heard more about than they care to hear again, because they're all like, we didn't get to go, so shut up. But there was a lady who gave a presentation called The Anxious Language Learner and talked about anxiety with language learning. And one of the things she had commented on was that there's this very high correlation showing that those who learn language for a grade do not do well.
Yeah.
And that it is poor. And that basically admonishing the idea of academic
and
teaching.
And your work.
Language and my work as well. But all that aside, you have had what you've said is mostly a positive experience with learning languages in the classroom setting. You want to talk a little bit about why for you learning it in an academic setting was actually a positive experience?
I think in a lot of ways it boils down to like personality and personal preference. Because there were people in my Greek class, for instance, that at, our third semester final probably got the same grade as me, but today would probably not recall much of any of it because they were doing it for the grade. I'm incredibly motivated by grades to a point of unhealthy perfectionism, which is a story for another day. But
when I run a psychology blog, we'll have you back on.
Great. I've got tons of material for
next project.
So I am heavily, and always have been heavily motivated by like doing the very best I can. So I went into each of these classes wanting an A. If I felt like I deserved less than an A at the end, if I, realistically looked at that test and said, oh no, like I deserved the B that I got, I could make peace with it. I wasn't happy. But in the end, I think I was able to keep a relatively clear mind about why I was learning the languages, that they were a tool to the bigger investment of, the degrees or biblical studies. So I really went into it, yes, wanting to get an A, but because getting an A meant that I got it, that I had learned it.
I think that's interesting. It's all, you're talking in a way about being able to correlate a short-term and a long-term motivation at once, which I think is one of the biggest things language learners have to do. You have to be able to find the little wins and celebrate those, which the grades would be those little wins. Yeah. But you are chasing this bigger overall picture, which you had with wanting to be able to understand this text.
Like I wanted to be able to nail a 100 on every single vocab test. Because, I need my A's, but also because that means that I know those words now. Yes. Or at least I'm going to recall them when they come up in review and I'm going to be closer to knowing them. Because at the end of it, I wanted to be able to sit in a church service and have the original text out and follow along. And I wanted somebody to be like, stop me afterwards and go, this passage confuses me, and be able to turn there and not have to go, and just be able to translate a little on the fly, even if it's not great, but be able to know, give them something more than someone who didn't know the languages. So I think that, my motivation, although tainted all the way throughout by my perfectionism, remained at its core very pure in that I wanted to get to this point where I could work with the text and I could explain it to people. And so my goal in the large sense was this understanding and learning while still kind of having this like coat of perfectionism and A-drivenness over top of it. So I don't know if I'd be more effective or less if I wasn't such a perfectionist. That's the kicker.
That's a good question.
But in my case, I found that learning both languages in an academic setting was what I needed. Yeah. I don't know that, I wanted to know biblical Hebrew prior to going to grad school, but until I could take a class, I didn't learn it. I learned the alphabet and a few other scattered things. So I think that for me personally, that presence of assignments and grades were the motivation I needed. And also just that idea that somebody else was curating what I was learning so that I wasn't coming up to like, okay, well, I got nouns, now what? I wasn't stalling out anywhere. The professor was constantly guiding you into the next thing and keeping you just that perfect amount of overwhelmed that like you always knew you were learning something new. Yeah. It wasn't just old hat at any point in time. And so by myself, I feel like I would one, be driven so much by like perfecting my knowledge of something that I'd sit and spin on nouns forever. But then also, I don't know that I would know what to tackle after that. Yes. So I liked having the guidance of more than just like a book, but having someone going, well, we can't sit and think about this because you have this assignment and it does another thing entirely.
Yeah. That was one thing we were both saying. We said one thing that's frustrating if you are not knowledgeable in educational theories, particularly language learning theory, as some people in the room are, or you have a very high frustration tolerance, as some other people in the room are. That's raising his hand at the time. There is that frustration of you don't know what's too much and you don't know what's too little. It's very easy to stay in that, well, I know how to understand this and I'm going to just keep reading this same thing.
Yep.
You know, and there might be 2 words you don't know, so you keep focusing on that. Or doing the opposite and saying, I am going to learn how to, as you put it, that many people at some point in your study are like, I'm going to make my own translation of the Bible. And you realize, like 4 chapters in, that's not as fun as you thought it would be.
It's scary. And oh my gosh, this word occurs once, so I was never going to learn it in my flashcards. You know, those kind of things. Yeah. And, you know, some people are sick and twisted and they like diving into stuff that frustrates them. And we're
mocking him without saying we're mocking fun. Brad. Sorry.
But, you know, it's something like Brad can enjoy figuring out what to learn next.
Yes.
I never would have. I would have begged someone to tell me or assign me something.
Well, and for you, the process wasn't the point.
Right.
It was for this bigger purpose. It was for this other purpose. And not that it wasn't with other people, but for some people, the process can be fun. And some people, it's not at all.
Yeah.
So.
And I feel like I'm a very like goal end oriented person. And so to get through the basics of grammar and then go, well, what now? I still can't just pick up the Bible and read it, but I've got the basics. So where do I focus in? What do I tackle? That would have been really frustrating. Yeah. I think I would have stalled out at that point, if not given up entirely.
Yeah.
And so having it tied to my degree, tied to my GPA was enough motivation to have that constant force behind the endeavor where I never gave up on it. I never stopped working on it. And I certainly never stalled out in like what I was learning.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, I think that's where a lot of people sometimes get into trouble with grammar. They learn a crap ton of vocab because you can find vocab lists for anything, anywhere for a language. But a lot of people with grammar, they just don't even know where to start.
Yeah.
And I mean, yes, if you are of a certain mindset, you and I both talked about, and Brad's the same way. We all like diagramming sentences. We're the grammar freaks of the world. They're fine.
So fun.
It really is. We would buy workbooks like this.
That was one of the devastating things about Hebrew because it's not verb centric and because sometimes it's missing and it just operates so differently. You can't diagram Hebrew sentences. And that was so sad because we spent like half a semester diagramming Greek and it was so much fun. And all of my classmates complained and I was always the one who's like, I'll do it. Yes. I'll go up to the board. Let me.
Exactly. And I said, but for some people, sitting down reading a grammar book is daunting. And again, they just don't even know how to parse this. Like, what do I actually need to get out of this to be able to move on with my language study?
I think I mentioned it earlier when I was TAing for Hebrew in grad school. I would have students in my study group that would get overwhelmed because we were moving on and they didn't understand nouns yet. Or we were moving on and I didn't get that verb form. And I had to explain to one girl who was near tears that we weren't trying to teach her exhaustively these categories, these grammatical categories. Yes. We were constructing boxes for her to put the bits and pieces in. So I'm like, we're moving on, yes, but you do not have to feel like you exhaustively understand nouns yet. We're going to come back and explain those things that you're stuck on right now. And then you can dump them in that box that you already built. Yeah. So just take what we've given you, understand it the best that you can, and then start building the other box.
I like that theory for a lot of things with language learning because I think for people who are high-driven, type A perfectionists, language learning is hard for the very basic reason that you're never going to be perfect.
Right.
And
it's hard to do any part of it perfect at all.
And you have to just accept that you're going to keep adding to boxes, but you're probably never going to fill them.
Yeah. And that was, especially when I started in Greek, because that was my first language that I really wanted to learn. Handing in crappy translations was painful. I'm like, this isn't good. This doesn't sound good. I don't think it's accurate. I don't understand this one thing. And I know that I didn't probably do it justice, but it's due. And I don't know how to do it any better. And I've already frustrated myself and my roommate is glaring at me because I keep sighing. That's very defeating if you require perfection of yourself. And it's funny because that actually, I got A's on those assignments because my professor knew that was the very best someone who has been given what you are given could have done with that. And, it was good I sat there with it for 3 hours and tried to translate these 3 sentences. And it took that long and I agonized and it wasn't perfect, but it was for that state of being, and that was a very hard lesson to learn. And if I could extrapolate that to the rest of my life, I'd probably be a healthier person. Haven't crossed that bridge yet.
Eventually.
But in language learning, you know, that became more natural, so that when I hit Hebrew, it was like, yeah, my translations are going to be crap at first because I don't understand this language. But I learned a whole new alphabet, and it reads right to left, and that's weird, but like that's not so weird to me anymore, and so maybe that's good enough.
Yeah.
And you get that reinforced when you get good grades back on quizzes that, you know, it's not perfect, but like you're grasping as much as we put in your boxes at this point. Exactly. Now it's time for the next load.
Yeah. Well, I like that point about due dates, that in some ways due dates can be helpful for the very reason of they don't allow you to wallow in perfectionism.
Right.
You have to just say, ship it. Yeah, it's done.
Yeah.
So I think that's important. It's interesting, though. It sounds like you had a much more positive third language learning experience than like either myself or even Brad did. Like both of us have said our third language has been different, and we both feel we've been lied to by the language enthusiasm community has basically told us that your third language will be cake. And both of us have said something that was not appropriate for this podcast.
Maybe you just didn't pick good third languages to learn.
I think part of it for us was, you know, you just said you walked into it with, I know I'm going to suck at this at first. Yeah. And you saw that as almost freeing.
Yeah.
And we walked into it as, we're going to suck at this at first. What the hell? I got good at this. I shouldn't have to suck at this again.
Yeah, and I feel like I had, you know, when I started Hebrew, it was like, okay, I feel like I'm already behind, but I remember this feeling. I had this feeling not so long ago, and now I am boss at this other thing.
Yeah, maybe you started, like, you got your third language in sooner than we did, and maybe that was the...
It's possible. And I mean, the approach was very similar in the two, and while the two languages are very different, the way they were approached in the teaching and learning is very similar. So that may have helped me too.
True.
I don't know. It's one of those that like I never relished being bad at anything, but it was kind of, by the time I was getting into Hebrew, it was familiar. And so it felt like, okay, I'm sucking at this and I'm crying over this assignment and it is taking me 5 hours to do 2 sentences. But that happened in this other thing, so now I know it's working. Like, this is how it's supposed to be. If I was taking 10 hours on these 2 sentences, I'd be worried. But I remember the 5 hours. Like, this is fine. And so I think there was that aspect of, like, Greek was the one I was less motivated to learn, less dedicated to. And yet once I was in it, I was, you know, very dedicated to learning as well as I could. And I got to a point where I was incredibly happy with where I was at. And so I kind of learned the process in a place where I wasn't so heavily invested, and then took that process into the one that I really wanted to learn, where like, you know, not to say Brad does not want to learn Mandarin, but like Japanese is like his, you know, his closest to his heart. Yeah. That was his first endeavor, and he worked out all the kinks in his approach. And so then maybe hopping over to a second one that's not as like close or dear to you makes it more difficult. Whereas mine was inverted just because my undergrad didn't offer me the language I wanted to learn, so I had to put it off.
I also wonder if because you happen to do both in an academic setting and he did not do either in an academic setting, and I am doing my second one in a non-academic setting when I would probably be more like you and prefer an academic setting. I do wonder if being able to rely that on someone else. I had said the thing I had going for me in Spanish that people don't seem to understand is I walked into Spanish class and I assumed I'd walk out speaking it. I said I never even thought that was a possibility. I didn't understand that people did that they could walk out of 4 years in high school and not speak it. And obviously it happens. I teach Spanish now, and I can tell you it happens. I struggle against it. I struggle valiantly against it. But with that said, I think maybe possibly part of it is you trust that the teacher is going to impart that to you, provided you do your part as a student. And when you're doing it all on your own, you have both roles. Right. And sometimes you're not showing up for one of them.
Yeah. And that does kind of, you know, your expectation, your personal expectation going into your high school language class was different than like a lot of your classmates. Yes. And so the result was different magically, which I saw too. You know, I wanted to learn and retain Greek and Hebrew. And and Greek needs some polishing, I know now, but like, I don't think it would be that hard for me to get there because I really learned it. Whereas a lot of people just studied it so repetitiously that they were able to regurgitate it on an exam, and then they drained that energy. That energy
they were checking boxes, but they weren't. Yeah.
Right. And so, you know, I feel like for me, if I were to pursue another language outside of an academic setting, my expectations would just kind of like not really have a ceiling, and so it would be very hard to know how to go about it. Mm-hmm. You know, I would be like, I had like a course description to base my expectations on, and then I had my personal ones too. Mm-hmm. But then to just be like, oh, here, I'm going to dabble in this thing, but like really I want to be fluent, but how do I get there because I don't have someone to get me there because I don't have anybody else's expectations. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can understand why that would be tough.
I'm just curious, and it never even occurred to me until you were talking about it, because I'm sitting here going, wow, all of us have had very different reactions with our third language, and I'm sitting here going, I wonder if you feel you can trust a program, trust the teacher, trust that someone else is taking on a portion of the responsibility for your learning. Not that you aren't ultimately still responsible, because as you put it, there are plenty of students sitting in that class that did not walk out with the knowledge you did. But if you feel like you can trust that part of the load's being taken care of.
Right. Someone's trying to make sure you don't drown.
Yes.
Whereas when you're on your own, you're like, oh shoot, my floaty just popped, and like I'm trying to overinflate the other one, but like I'm also trying to swim here.
Yeah, I'm like, I think sometimes I'm just going to float here in the ocean for a while. I don't even care about getting to the island anymore. So it's all right.
This is fine. This place is fine. I like this.
It's fine. The sharks are circling. No one cares.
I made friends with this seagull, so that's cool.
Exactly. Oh, well, this has been really great. Can you give our listeners a few resources in case they're interested in learning Koine Greek or biblical Hebrew? Because I know obviously you've had several.
Absolutely.
And we talked about there aren't as many things out there available.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly, I'm not going to give the same advice that my brother did in that, you know, he sat and listened to anime and sang songs and stuff. And I'm like, well, I've got the Bible. And they didn't make like podcasts or TV shows out of it back then. So yeah, I mean, I learned in a much more one of those, you know, kind of purely academic ways, especially Greek. The grammar that I used and loved to death is this blessed little book, Basics of Biblical Greek, by Mounts, and it's published by Zondervan.
And I'll be putting a link to where you could find this on Amazon or something in the show notes. So.
And it actually, I'm realizing, comes with like an interactive CD thing. I never used it because I'm like, no, I'll do it myself with flashcards and brawn. But this Zondervan does with these series, because they also have one for biblical Hebrew, which I didn't use in my class, but it does exist. They also make flashcard boxes.
Yeah.
That, you know, will put the amount of occurrences on them and will give you kind of a framework to start learning the vocabulary, which can be really helpful. One
thing I did find really interesting was that you actually like the tangible flashcards more than the digital, which is unusual.
Yeah.
But you said, you know, you want to explain why you prefer the one or the other?
I think that I liked the power-hungry control I had over the physical ones. We're sensing a theme here. My brother did, from his Japanese study, say, oh, hey, I used this flashcard program. And I was like, cool, I'll give it a try with Greek. And I made the cards, and it was good because it taught me how to type in Greek, which was even better for my homework. Mm-hmm. But I didn't like that there was no way for me to really control, like, when I was going to see a card again. There was, in that, you know, you clicked different ratings and, you know, it would kick it back a certain amount of time. But sometimes I'd, you know, be like, oh, yeah, I was pretty confident, so 5. And then it was like, it'll come back in a month. And I was like, no, I want it in like a week or so.
I wasn't that confident.
Right. Like, okay, 5 means something different to you than it does to me. So then I'd like have to go back through and wipe the history of every card. And then suddenly I have all the cards again to go through, and that's crippling. So I found I just preferred to either use the pre-made ones or make my own, which was good, just practicing writing the script itself. Sometimes, you know, you'd be sitting watching a stupid movie with your friends while you were making flashcards, and that would pop back up, and you'd be like, oh, I was making this while, watching Frozen, and the little, snowman showed up at this point, and so now I remember this word. Right. So I think it had an added benefit where on one hand, it wasn't as frustrating to me in my actual use of them, but two, there was just that extra little connectedness that I had. So I really preferred having paper ones.
Well, and like we said, we both like to write, or I use digital ones, but I like to type up my own. But sometimes having these pre-made ones come with this book are handy if you just don't even know where to start, especially when you first start. A lot of us don't even know what to put on a flashcard.
Right. Yeah, and I had told a story where at the beginning of Greek, I hadn't bought the box set, and so I was making my own flashcards. And you have the beginnings of these boxes with they're a quarter full. And so by the time I got to my third semester and the boxes were much fuller than they were, I realized I had been making all of my verb flashcards the wrong way. Not wrong in an absolute sense, but I realized it wasn't in the way that I was learning them anymore. It wasn't that framework that I built for myself. And so I was going back and changing cards and trying to white things out. And so I ended up asking my professor, shoot straight with me here. Am I right in saying that this is a better way to learn it? And do I need to just go through and burn all of these flashcards and start new ones? And he was like, well, depends how dedicated you are, which is, yes, burn your flashcards and start over.
Code for you're in trouble now.
Right. So, I should have been studying for my final, but I spent one day remaking all of my verb flashcards, but I'm glad because I learned them better. But I do think I used pre-made ones in Hebrew, and at the beginning that was a lifesaver because they gave me stuff I didn't know I needed to pay attention to that time. Which the Greek ones may have had I gotten them. So that was helpful. And there was a point at which I realized I was conceptualizing, the verb components different than the cards were doing them. So then I started making all my own verb cards and eventually all my own cards for everything. But to start out, it took some of the load off where you're like, I don't even know what to write on this. I don't understand.
Yeah, it does that. And also, we all know sometimes when you're in a college class and you do have, as you put it, you had 3 other college classes,
right?
In other topics.
Yeah.
And that's actually a topic I will circle back to before we finish. Sorry, forgot about that. But there is a point where you don't have time. Right. You simply don't have time to make all those flashcards at that moment.
Yeah.
And while you may think, I want to make my own, if you don't have the time, you don't have the time.
Yeah. You may be prioritizing that class much higher than all the others, but that doesn't mean you're not doing the others.
Yes.
So it can be helpful just to take some of that, monotonous workload that maybe isn't all that, I think it does help to make your own cards in that you have kind of that connection to them, but it's not critical. You can get by without that. And so if you're short on time, if you're concentrating on a lot of things at once, the pre-made things can save you a lot of time and frustration.
Exactly. You want to talk about the other book you have sitting here before I ask you the question I wanted to ask?
This one is interesting. The title is Beginning Biblical Hebrew. It's by John Cook and Robert Holmstead. And John Cook was actually a professor at my grad school.
Oh, really? Okay.
So he was a fabulous human being as well.
Is he responsible for the lovely illustrations in this book?
He is not personally, but his stories of developing this with the other professor who was at a different school were hilarious because they butted heads on so many things, and he would just slam this other guy and make jokes, and you could tell they were such good friends, and they had done this thing together, and they just had these little things to talk
because
about.
Working with your friends, this is the only way you're going to survive.
Right.
Is if
you're
you
going to
can
go,
rip
oh,
on
he
each
did
other.
that wasn't me. But the interesting thing about this, the book by Mounts for Greek is very much your typical language learning grammar book. It goes through, it breaks stuff down, gives you examples, all of that.
Cut and dry.
Yeah. This one is a little bit different in that the front portion of the book is your typical grammar things. They're a little bit more workbooky than the other one, but still you're learning it in a similar form. But if you flip the book over, you're reading it Hebrew ways, because right to left, the back is actually a biblical comic book.
Which I did not know existed until this moment.
There's actually this is totally getting off a point, but you might enjoy this. There is a manga version of the Bible where Jesus is like a frickin' Middle Eastern samurai. So just look into it.
Note to self. I'll be putting a link to that in the show notes too.
But this is interesting because it does kind of take on that idea that maybe learning just pure grammar can get frustrating. And so what they do is they take snippets of the actual biblical text, remove the things that are beyond your understanding, and they give you a pared down version of it in a comic strip, which makes it just a little bit happier. It's like, oh, look, he's going to sacrifice Isaac. That's sweet.
And pictures make everything better.
Right, and brightly colored pictures, too. These aren't black and white pictures, people. So those are, you don't initially go into those. You get like a month or so into the workbook and it starts referring you to the back. And so we would have assignments where we had to translate the portion that was in the comic. And then there are sections afterwards that are kind of like a workbook sort of thing, and we'd get assigned some of those. And I think that that was helpful in that you get the feeling that you're working with like your end goal a little bit sooner.
Yeah.
You're not like trying to build all those boxes and still not getting to touch the biblical text at all. You're still not, you're not in the biblical text. But when you actually do get to it, it's going to be real familiar because it was stuck in those in like a simplified form. So it makes you feel like you're actually doing something a lot sooner than some methods.
True.
So I have suggested it to a few people that have been kind of interested in learning Hebrew outside of an academic sense, and I haven't heard from them if they found it, effective on their own, because obviously I had lecture on top of it. But I think it might be a genuinely decent way, maybe more accessible than just picking up a grammar and trying to pick your way through it. It might give you more exercises that help you feel like you're using it and may actually help you learn it a bit faster.
Making progress.
Yeah.
Okay. The one thing I was going to mention, and I was going to ask back when we were talking about the academic, was if there was any negative, because I liked what you had to say earlier. What did you feel, if anything, was the drawback to the way your academic program was set up?
And I got frustrated a lot with having to split my attention because I am a perfectionist and I was very passionate about getting the best understanding of the languages that I could. So I hated that there were times, like you said, I didn't have time to make flashcards. Or, I could probably get this translation assignment a little bit more fine-tuned, better sounding, but I also have this 10-page paper waiting for me, and I don't want to fail that class either, because I need A's in everything. So I had said, I guess the negative for me was I felt oftentimes like I wanted to just be doing Greek or just be doing Hebrew. And if there had been a semester where I was getting more of it crammed into that semester, but it was the only thing I was doing, that would have been positive. And I liked that you had kind of that pushback of like, but you get really overwhelmed at the beginning.
Yeah. I said, though, it kind of correlates to how they push for study abroad in modern languages. Yeah. And so then I had asked you, I said, do you think you would wanted to have done that right off the bat? Or do you think you would have wanted that base knowledge over, the little bit over a time and then...
Yeah, and I think had I been able to, make my own college experience, I would have loved to, in the midst of a semester where I was taking, 2, 3, 4 other classes, being able to throw, the beginning elementary Hebrew or Greek 1 into that semester. And have that relief of like, okay, I can put my freaking flashcards aside and go write in English and I'll be happy. But once I think you break past that point of like, oh my gosh, it's another language, and you freak out every time you have to translate anything. And that becomes more natural, and it's just refining your ability to do so. At that point, I would have loved to be able to just pour all of my time into it and, taken 3 Hebrew or Greek classes and just been working on that for a semester.
Well, like you said, it was starting to permeate to everything else you did anyway.
Right. because I'd have other classes where, I'm learning Greek, and then this other class that's not assuming I know Greek at all is like, oh, hey, write a paper about 1 Corinthians. And you were like, okay, but I want to translate it first, but I'm not good enough to translate it first. And you end up getting stuck in the desire to use this ability that you kind of have and the reality that you don't have the time to actually use it because you're not very good at it yet. So it would have been nice to like learn those basics, be at that place where it's like, I'm not even going to pretend to try to use it on my other homework because I don't understand it right now. And then hit the ground running with just, let's refine all of this, get really good at it, learn a ton of vocab in the space where that's not overwhelming, and then get to go back into everything else and use it as a tool in that, and not have to have that like internal struggle of, do I have time? Am I doing it right? Am I not doing it right? Exactly. Am I failing myself miserably? Answer is always yes.
Of course. So, well, this has been really fun. Before we sign off, are there any languages you're hoping to learn or currently learning? What's going on with you in languages right now?
We left earlier because I said that I didn't really have any languages I wanted to learn. I just had ones I wanted to know.
Which I think most of us would love to take the magic bullet at least once. So
yeah, it would be nice. There are other languages. Actually, as you were talking earlier, I would love to know Arabic. I think it's fascinating.
Okay.
And kind of, you know, it's couched in that same sort of cultural, geographical location that I've already worked in.
Yes.
And that would just be a fascinating other aspect to everything.
And I've heard so many people say that they feel like knowing Hebrew and Arabic helps them understand that whole area so much better. Right. Because now they're getting both sides of everything. And
how much do we need some more understanding in that whole area? So that's one of the things that is kind of run at the back of my mind. And I wonder, I do know someone who learned Arabic in undergrad, and I've been meaning to, you know, ask her, how difficult was it? Like, did you feel like you got a lot of reward out of it? To decide if that's something I want to pour some time into and try to attempt. But also, obviously, Japanese has been appealing to me because I've watched Brad be really successful at it, given in a way that's totally inaccessible to me.
And he'd really like someone to have a secret language with, because I'm just too slow.
Those moments where, you know, we're at home and our parents are talking about something, and
that would be helpful.
You know, you make faces, but there could be so much to be said. So, and you know, we grew up in the same household, and we sat down at, you know, 5 o'clock for Toonami to watch Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon. And so I have loved anime and manga since I was young, and I enjoy that in its English form, but also knowing what original languages has done to other things, it would be great to be able to experience those things that I already love in that way. And I've absorbed enough that I do watch anime in Japanese with English subtitles, because I don't want a crappy dub. Like, I want to experience the original, and I've picked up enough that I can get the gist of some things sometimes.
Yeah. And we said there's this advantage of, at least if you're listening it to it in the original, you're getting the original inflections and everything. Yeah. And that, while there might be text, the text wouldn't be tainted with those particular nuances.
Yeah, and I think it can be a learning tool. You know, you can realize you've been hearing something and seeing something a whole bunch. And I've actually seen articles that say that parents should turn subtitles on their TVs forever when they have young kids, because it will help them become literate sooner. Yeah,
and I have actually seen that with deaf students who are growing up learning, of course, ASL. Hopefully ASL, if their parents are doing what, in my opinion, is emotionally beneficial for, you know, profoundly deaf students. Another story for another day. But they have said many deaf students whose parents are putting on closed captioning early are actually becoming fantastic readers. Yeah. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, the more common thing was that you had adult deaf people who were at a 10-year-old's reading level. And it was just absolutely terrible, because they, of course, are learning this beautiful visual language that does not have a writing system. And what they are finding is, by having that captioning on sooner, of course, they're not getting the benefit of the sound, but they are seeing everything that's going on, and things are connecting in a way that hopefully they can add to it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've found I have way more of a, like, tiny, limited knowledge of Japanese than I would if I was, you know, just listening to anime in English and stuff. So that's a language I would love to know. I'm not so jazzed about learning, because I don't know how to approach live languages. So while I've had great success with a first and second language, like in a learning experience, I don't know. Maybe this would be my language that frustrates me real bad, because it doesn't fit in that framework that I've
When you would certainly be approaching it differently, unless you decide to go back and take a class of some sort.
And so I keep trying to get Brad to, like, take a book, translate it, and then make assignments for vocab list. because that's the only thing I know what to do is like, here, let's limit it to this one book, and then you can translate it so I can refer to that. So yeah, I mean, there are like grammar in general is fascinating to me. And so I think I will always enjoy learning any language just because I love language. So I don't really have like a laundry list of languages I would like to learn, but if life or interests geared me towards one.
If a purpose shows itself.
Right, which is, Japanese has that because my brother knows it. I know other people who know it. I enjoy some of the media from that culture. So if those same kind of circumstances arose around German or, something else, I might be motivated to do it, but I don't feel like drawn to particular languages just because they sound nice or whatever. It's always kind of geared towards that. Like, I have an end here that I'm trying to achieve.
Exactly. All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. All right.
I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as we enjoyed recording it. Listening to it again, I was just amazed at how many different concepts we hit on. Language and culture, language and thought. A lot of these concepts I hadn't really dived into since I took my linguistics degree a few years ago. So I hope that you found something new to explore, or that you learned something, or just something that interested you. As always, there is more information in the show notes. I hope you check those out. And please feel free to send me feedback of any sort. I plan to continue trying this experiment with the podcast, maybe some other little riffs. And I actually got a new microphone for Christmas, so this should be getting interesting and fun for me. As always, peace out, my polyglot peeps.